Welcome back, my dear friends, my beloved literature enthusiasts who have wandered with me time and again to the labyrinths of storytelling. Today, I invite you to sit with me as we explore Freakier Friday, a film that, on the surface, glitters with a sheen of comedy and lighthearted fantasy, but beneath trembles with the deeper resonances of identity, generational tension, and the strange alchemy of human empathy. As always, this is not a typical review. I am not here to sell you the movie or grade it with arbitrary stars or ratings. Instead, we will wander together through a more thoughtful, intellectual passage, treating this film as one might treat a novel discovered in an attic, opening its yellowed pages slowly, savoring the scent of nostalgia, the texture of words, the echoes it carries across time. I ask only that, if you are kind enough, you help sustain this little corner of Cinema Vault, like subscribe, share. Not as a transaction, but as a gesture of kinship, a signal fire to others who crave not just to consume movies, but to live with them, to wrestle with them, to let them leave marks on our memory. When I think of this story, I cannot help but feel the weight of its heritage. Its predecessor, that charming inversion of roles, already played like a parable about misunderstanding and reconciliation between generations. But this sequel carries itself differently. It knows it is coming into a world scarred by more than just family squabbles. It comes into a cultural moment where the distance between parent and child feels not just like a gap of years, but a chasm carved by technology, shifting norms, and the ceaseless whirl of modernity. And perhaps that is what fascinates me most, the way it dares to ask whether empathy is enough to stitch us together when the world insists on pulling us apart. There are movies that live comfortably within their genre, obeying the rules like dutiful citizens, content to deliver what is expected. Then there are others, rare ones, that toy with the familiar only to reveal something strangely unsettling beneath. This one, while wrapped in the brightly colored paper of comedy and fantasy, slips into that latter category, and it begins in the most deceptively ordinary way. A family, fractured in ways that are both obvious and subtle, navigating the banal rhythms of suburban life. A mother, a daughter, each convinced of the other's incomprehensibility. It is the classic dance of eye rolls, unfinished sentences, and accusations of, "You don't understand me," but with a modern twist that makes it sting just a little sharper. As the story unfolds, we find ourselves watching them in the most vulnerable of spaces, not in their arguments, but in their silences. The mother staring at bills late at night, too weary to protest against the injustice of carrying the world on her shoulders. The daughter scribbling anxieties into the margins of a notebook, her heart clawing for autonomy while still tethered to the invisible rope of expectation. These details matter. They transform the film from simple body swap farce into something nearer to allegory. Because when the magic happens, the strange, inexplicable collision of souls, it does not feel like a cheap trick of fantasy. It feels like a punishment and a gift in the same breath, as though fate itself had grown tired of their stubbornness and decided to intervene. And oh, the humor works, of course. Comedy hums along in the background like a mischievous violin, bow scraping playfully across the strings. We laugh when the mother stumbles through teenage slang, her lips wrapping awkwardly around phrases that sound alien in her mouth. We laugh again when the daughter attempts to command authority in spaces where respect is earned not through bravado, but through the exhaustion of years. But if we linger too long on the laughter, we miss the tragedy, how much they must endure to finally see each other. It is a human condition condensed into slapstick and irony, like Shakespeare slipping sorrow between his clown's jests. There are key events, moments that shape the rhythm of this tale, and I will not spoil them fully here, though I must tease them. There is a wedding rehearsal, grand and glittering, that spirals into chaos as identities collapse in a whirl of mistaken gestures and unspeakable confessions. There is a confrontation in the school hallway, lockers towering like silent witnesses, where anger and fear spill out in words that were never meant to be spoken aloud. There is a fragile reconciliation under the glow of streetlights, where two figures walk side by side but cannot yet hold hands, because forgiveness, like magic, requires its own ritual. And then there are the twists, unexpected, delicious, aching. This is not just a tale of two individuals trading shoes, but of the ripples that move outward. Friends, lovers, siblings, strangers, they all become unwitting participants in this strange masquerade. Secrets once carefully guarded are suddenly laid bare when spoken to the wrong lips. Truths once too painful to admit come rushing out when freed from the cage of pride. Watching it all unfold is like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, each topple inevitable, but still shocking when it finally happens. But beyond the events, what lingers is mood. The atmosphere is tinged with peculiar nostalgia, as though the film itself remembers the innocence of its predecessor, but cannot return there. It is aware of the weight of history. It knows that the world has grown darker, heavier, stranger since the last time we laughed at a swapped identity. And so it infuses that laughter with melancholy, reminding us that comedy and tragedy are not opposites, but twins born of the same womb. I remember sitting in the theater and thinking not about what was on screen, but about my own life, about how often I had wished to climb into the skin of someone I loved, if only for a day, to see the world through their eyes, to feel the weight of their choices pressing on my chest. I thought about my parents, my teachers, my friends, lovers past and present. What arguments might have evaporated had I been forced to live their hours, to breathe their fears. What tenderness might have bloomed sooner if I had tasted their exhaustion, their hunger, their hope. It is strange how a film draped in humor can stir such questions. Yet that is why I treasure it. There is a moment, brief, almost easy to miss, where a character gazes into a mirror and does not recognize a reflection. And that, perhaps, is a film in miniature, an exploration of what it means to be alien to yourself, and how, through that alienation, you might finally find empathy for another. The mirror shows not who we are, but who we might be if stripped of our stubbornness, our certainty, our roles. And in that uncertainty lies possibility. By the time the story crescendos toward its more chaotic heights, we are no longer laughing at the absurdity of the switch. We are holding our breath, aching for them to learn, to change, to soften, because in their journey, exaggerated as it is, we see our own stubbornness reflected. How many times have we insisted that someone could never understand us, only to discover that we had never offered them the chance? How many times have we worn our identities like armor, forgetting that they can also be cages? The beauty of the film is that it never allows the magic to overshadow the humanity. The spell is never explained in detail. It is treated with the same mystery as a dream upon waking. And in that ambiguity, the focus remains where it belongs, on the characters, on the raw ache of their transformation. We do not need to know how it happened. We only need to feel why it matters. And so, as the first act closes and the second begins to unfurl, we find ourselves not merely entertained, but implicated. We are asked not overtly, but in the subtle language of cinema, to examine our own lives, to ask whose shoes we have refused to step into, to ask what would happen if, for just one day, we allowed empathy to undo us. That is where I will leave you, for now, at the threshold of discovery. In the coming explorations, we will trace each step of the plot, unravel the threads of character, and wander behind the curtain into the strangest corners of production and symbolism. But tonight, let this be enough. The knowledge that beneath the laughter lies longing, beneath the comedy lies confession, and that perhaps the most freakish thing of all is how close a simple story can come to telling the truth about our own fragile hearts. It begins in the kind of morning that most of us have lived through, messy, loud, and charged with the invisible static of unspoken frustration. The kitchen hums with the sounds of breakfast, the pop of toast ejecting itself too soon, the scrape of a butter knife, the hiss of coffee pouring. The mother is rushing, always rushing, moving from one corner of the room to the other like a conductor of an orchestra no one listens to. The daughter sits slouched, phone in hand, earbuds dangling like ornaments, responding in monosyllables that cut sharper than silence. Their words never quite meet in the middle. They fly past each other like arrows aimed in the wrong direction. It is not cruelty. It is weariness, miscommunication masquerading as indifference. Watching them here is like catching the first tremor before an earthquake, that tiny shift of the ground you almost ignore until the walls start to shake. School looms over the daughter's life like an unyielding mountain. We follow her into the fluorescent-lit hallways, where lockers clang and chatter bursts like fireworks. She is half lost in her own world, caught between the desire to be noticed and the dread of what being noticed might actually bring. Friends orb around her, fragments of teenage chaos. Inside jokes, whispered gossip, laughter that sounds more like defense than joy. She walks with them, but never quite among them, already beginning to feel the alienation that fuels her tension at home. Teachers appear like gatekeepers, their authority heavy, their voices more like background noise and guidance. Each adult in her orbit seems like a closed door, and so she pushes harder against the only adult who is unavoidable, her mother. Meanwhile, the mother navigates a parallel world just as unforgiving. At work, she is confronted with deadlines, the constant hum of responsibility, and the subtle erosion of her own dreams beneath the avalanche of necessity. Her colleagues respect her, but only to the point of utility. She is dependable, reliable, the one everyone counts on but no one truly sees. Bills pile up on her desk at home like monuments to her exhaustion. Each envelope a reminder that the world takes more than it gives. She masks her fatigue behind the armor of routine, convincing herself that if she just keeps moving, just keeps organizing and providing, it will all somehow add up to love. The clash between them sharpens in the small moments. A sarcastic comment from the daughter sparks a defensive retort from the mother. The daughter insists she is misunderstood, that nobody listens. The mother counters with stories of sacrifice, of everything she has given up. Neither realizes that the more they try to prove themselves, the further apart they drift. The house itself feels like a battlefield, not through outright fights, but through slammed doors, rolled eyes, the passive-aggressive thud of footsteps on stairs. Every object seems to absorb their attention. The couch cushions, the plates in the sink, even the framed photographs from happier times that hang on the wall like silent accusations. And then, as in all stories where the ordinary tilts into the extraordinary, the accident arrives. It is not heralded by thunder or grand spectacle. It happens in the stillness of a moment charged with too much energy, like static finally sparking between two fingertips. A relic, an object that seems innocuous enough, maybe a charm, maybe a trinket with a history neither of them fully understands, becomes a conduit. Words are exchanged in anger, shouted with a kind of force that almost dares the universe to respond. And the universe does. In the blink of an eye, the ground shifts beneath them. When they open their eyes again, they are no longer themselves. At first, the horror is comical. The mother stares down at hands that are too smooth, too young, decorated with bracelets she would never choose. The daughter gapes at her reflection, aghast at the wrinkles, the tired eyes, the weight of years etched into a body she never wanted to imagine inhabiting. Their screams overlap, echoing through the house like a duet of disbelief. The comedy of their panic, the absurdity of their gestures, touching their faces, tugging at their clothes, lulls us into laughter. Yet beneath that laughter lies a darker undercurrent. They are about to live what they once only imagined in nightmares, being trapped in each other's lives. The first test arrives almost immediately. The mother, now inhabiting her daughter's body, is thrust into the chaos of high school. The noise, the cliques, the labyrinth of social codes. She stumbles through it all like a traveler in a foreign land without a map. Friends approach with inside jokes she doesn't understand. Teachers call on her with questions she cannot answer. Even the act of walking through the cafeteria becomes an ordeal. Every table a tribunal of judgmental eyes. She tries to imitate, to mimic her daughter's swagger, but it comes across awkward, alien, as if the mask doesn't quite fit. Every slip, every misplaced phrase, tightens a knot of humiliation in her chest. She begins to realize just how merciless the teenage world can be, how fragile confidence is when constantly tested by peers. Meanwhile, the daughter, now trapped in her mother's body, faces a different battlefield. The office is cold, bureaucratic, filled with jargon and politics she barely understands. She sits behind a desk piled with paperwork that seems to multiply the longer she stares at it. Colleagues treat her with the respect reserved for age, but their words are laced with expectations she cannot meet. Simple tasks, sending an email, handling a phone call, become monumental hurdles when filtered through the inexperience of youth. Even her body betrays her. The aches in the shoulders, the weariness in the eyes, the heaviness of responsibilities. For the first time, she tastes the exhaustion her mother carries daily, and it is almost unbearable. Their parallel humiliations mirror one another, unfolding with a rhythm that feels both comedic and tragic. The mother cannot grasp the subtleties of slang, misinterpreting words to the laughter of classmates. The daughter bungles a meeting, her youthful arrogance slipping through cracks in her mother's weary voice. Each believes they are failing, not realizing that failure is the only path toward understanding. As the days stretch, secrets unravel. The mother learns of her daughter's anxieties. Hidden behind sarcasm and bravado, she discovers the pressures of fitting in, the small cruelties of social hierarchies, the silent loneliness masked by laughter. The daughter, in turn, uncovers the endless sacrifices her mother has endured, dreams deferred, joys postponed, all for the sake of providing stability. She feels the sting of casual dismissals from co-workers, the invisible labor of maintaining a household, the quiet grief of being unseen. And yet, as much as they begin to see each other's burdens, their tempers still flare. Arguments erupt, now absurdly misaligned, with a daughter scolding her mother from the body of a teenager and a mother snapping back through the lips of an adult. The irony is almost too sharp to bear. They scream, not realizing that every word spoken is another step toward revelation. There are scenes that linger, etched into the first half like milestones. One unfolds at a rehearsal dinner, where the daughter, still trapped in her mother's form, tries to maintain composure while juggling expectations from relatives and in-laws. The comedy of her fumbling attempts hides a heartbreak of realizing how much weight her mother carries alone. Another takes place in a classroom, where the mother, inhabiting her daughter's body, delivers an unexpectedly raw outburst that silences her peers. In that moment, her voice, though coming from the mouth of a teenager, echoes with the authority of experience, shocking everyone into a rare stillness. Slowly, reluctantly, the edges of their resentment soften. They are not yet allies, not yet reconciled, but something shifts. In private moments, they catch themselves almost confessing, almost reaching for the words of apology or gratitude that tremble on their tongues. But pride still holds them back. They are learning, but learning is slow, and the magic does not allow shortcuts. The first half ends with chaos threatening to unravel the fragile progress they have made. Misunderstandings pile up, secrets threaten to spill, and the facade each maintains begins to crack. Both of them stand at the precipice of collapse, surrounded by people who think they know who they are, but cannot possibly guess the truth. And as they stare into the mirror, seeing not themselves but the stranger they have become, they are forced to ask a question neither wanted to face. How long can they live this lie before it destroys them both? The world does not pause to let them adjust. It never does. Life keeps moving, dragging them along, forcing them to stumble through days that feel borrowed, fragile, and utterly exhausting. By now, they have both grown accustomed to the shock of seeing a stranger in the mirror each morning, but the weight of it has not lessened. If anything, it presses heavier with each passing day, as though time itself were reminding them that this masquerade cannot last forever. And yet, neither knows how or when it will end. The magic offers no instructions, no countdown, no path to reversal. It only demands that they endure. Tensions swell when outside eyes begin to notice cracks. The daughter, still struggling to inhabit her mother's body, fumbles once again at work, this time with consequences that ripple further. A report goes missing, a client storms out, and whispers snake through the office halls. For the first time, she feels the sting of professional failure not just as embarrassment, but as jeopardy. People's livelihoods, her family's stability, all bound up in responsibilities she never knew her mother bore so silently. Sitting at that desk, staring at a computer screen blurred by tears she refuses to let fall, she understands for the first time what it means to live every day with the quiet terrors of letting everyone down. Meanwhile, the mother, lost in her daughter's life, faces her own reckoning. A confrontation at school spirals into something sharper than embarrassment. She is cornered by peers who mock with cruelty sharper than knives, their words laced with casual malice that only teenagers seem capable of. For a moment she almost breaks, her instinct as an adult screaming to lash out, to crush them with the authority of years. But trapped in her daughter's body, she has no such power. Instead, she feels the vulnerability her child has lived with daily, the suffocating weight of social order, the endless calculation of how to appear strong while quivering inside. That night, when she lies in her bed in a body that is not hers, she does not sleep. She stares at the ceiling and aches with guilt for every time she dismissed her daughter's pain as trivial. Their parallel humiliations crescendo toward an inevitable breaking point. The rehearsal dinner that once felt merely awkward now teeters on disaster. The daughter, stumbling through her mother's role, is pressed for speeches, responsibilities, decisions she cannot handle. Every word she utters sounds like a betrayal of her mother's competence. Relatives exchange worried glances, and she feels the walls closing in. Across town, the mother endures the pressure of high school drama spilling into a hallway showdown, where secrets she barely understands are flung like grenades. Both moments collapse into chaos, leaving them each more isolated, more desperate than before. And then, as often happens in stories that blend comedy with tragedy, the world shifts again, not through magic this time, but through vulnerability. In a quiet moment, away from the chaos, they finally speak, not as mother and daughter, not even as two individuals still bitter from years of misunderstanding, but as two souls stripped bare by exhaustion. Words spill out clumsy and raw. Confessions that once seemed impossible find their way into the air. The daughter admits to fears she had buried under sarcasm. The mother admits to regrets she had hidden behind authority. It is not a perfect reconciliation. Not yet, but it is a crack in the wall through which light begins to seep. The plot tightens its grip as the stakes rise. The daughter, carrying her mother's burdens, faces a professional ultimatum. A presentation must be delivered, one that could determine the course of her mother's career. She trembles beneath the pressure, her teenage inexperience threatening to undo everything. Yet in that crucible, something strange happens. She finds strength not her own, but borrowed from the resilience of the woman whose skin she wears. She remembers late nights watching her mother at the kitchen table, bills spread like battle plans, determination etched into her tired face. Channeling that memory, she stumbles but does not fall. The presentation wavers but survives. The applause is polite, but in her heart, it feels like a triumph. At the same time, the mother confronts a pivotal moment in her daughter's life. A performance, a test, an audition. Something fragile and precious, the kind of event teenagers believe will determine the rest of their lives. She steps into it reluctantly, terrified of humiliating her daughter further. But as she stands there, facing the crowd of peers, she feels something stir. Years of discipline, of holding herself together, suddenly transform into courage. She does not deliver performance perfectly. How could she? But she delivers it sincerely. And sincerity, in a world where every teenager hides behind masks, shines like a flare. For the first time, her daughter's friends look at her differently, not with pity, but with awe. These victories are small, almost invisible from the outside, but monumental for them. For the first time, they feel not just the weight of each other's lives, but the possibility of surviving them. They see not only burdens, but strengths. The daughter realizes her mother's resilience is not born of obligation alone, but of love so fierce it has weathered every storm. The mother realizes her daughter's rebellion is not aimless, but the desperate cry of a soul trying to find itself. Each begins to forgive the other, though neither says the words outright. But the film, like life, does not allow them to rest in that fragile peace. The climax barrels forward, demanding resolution. A wedding approaches, the day looming like a tidal wave. Every unresolved tension, every hidden secret, every fragile truce threatens to collapse under the weight of ceremony. The daughter, in her mother's body, must stand before family and community, balancing grace and responsibility she barely understands. The mother, in her daughter's skin, must navigate the chaos of youth that spills into the event, jealousies, confessions, revelations. The two worlds collide in a storm of mistaken identities, near-exposed secrets, and emotional eruptions. It is in this chaos that the final twist reveals itself. The spell, the magic that bound them, begins to fray. They feel it in small ways, the flicker of recognition in their own reflections, the subtle shift of mannerisms returning to their rightful homes. But the magic does not return them until they have fully faced what they were meant to learn. And so, in the height of disaster, words shouted, truths exposed, tears spilling, they finally speak the words that matter. They tell each other not just that they are sorry, but that they see each other. that they always should have, that they always will. And then, like breath released after holding it too long, the world tilts back. The switch reverses. They collapse into their own bodies once more, disoriented but whole. The first touch of their own hands feels like a miracle. The first sight of their own faces, reflected in glass, feels like a homecoming. And yet, nothing is the same. They're themselves again, but altered, softer, wiser, more fragile and more strong all at once. The wedding proceeds, not flawlessly, but with a kind of imperfect beauty that feels more truthful than perfection ever could. Laughter mingles with tears. Mistakes become stories. And through it all, mother and daughter watch each other not as adversaries, but as allies. Their bond is not suddenly healed, not magically free of conflict, but reforged in fire, stronger because it has been tested. The film closes on a quieter note, not with grand spectacle, but with the tender simplicity of daily life. Another morning in the kitchen, another breakfast, another day beginning. The toast pops up, the coffee pours, the phone buzzes. But something is different. Their words, though still imperfect, meet in the middle now. Their silences feel companionable rather than hostile. They laugh, awkward but genuine. The world has not changed, but they have, and that, in the end, is the only magic that matters. What lingers after the chaos subsides is not the magic of the switch, nor even the spectacle of weddings, confrontations, or performances. What lingers of people themselves, their faces, their gestures, the fractures in their voices when they confess things they never meant to say. The characters live beyond the boundaries of the story, pressing against us until we cannot help but see fragments of ourselves within them. They are familiar not because of the specific plot that carries them, but because they embody the roles we have all inhabited. Child, parent, rebel, provider, critic, protector. The mother stands at the center of this storm like an ancient oak, scarred by years yet unbowed, her strength sometimes mistaken for hardness. She is written not as a saintly martyr, nor as a tyrant of domestic order, but as something far more complex, a woman who loves so fiercely that she sometimes smothers, who sacrifices so deeply that she occasionally resents those she sacrifices for. The magic that forces her into her daughter's skin is not punishment but revelation. Through the clumsy navigation of high school drama, she discovers not only her daughter's vulnerability, but also her own blindness. She realizes that the armor she thought was protecting her child had, in fact, been suffocating her. And yet, she also proves to herself that even stripped of authority, even reduced to the humiliations of adolescence, she still carries within her an irreducible resilience. She is, in many ways, the embodiment of endurance, not perfect endurance, not graceful endurance, but the stubborn, exhausted endurance that keeps families alive when everything else threatens to collapse. The daughter, by contrast, pulses with rawness, every emotion spilling to the surface in ways she cannot control. She is restless, caught between defiance and longing, her sarcasm a shield against the ache of being misunderstood. Her rebellion, though exaggerated by the comedic tone of the film, is painfully familiar. It is a rebellion of someone desperate to be seen as her own person, even as she aches for connection. Living in her mother's body forces her to confront the crushing responsibilities she once mocked or ignored, and in that confrontation, she begins to respect the quiet strength she had mistaken for joyless control. But more importantly, she discovers her own potential for resilience, the adult within her waiting to emerge, forged in the crucible of pressure and expectation. Her arc is not about taming her wildness, but about transforming it into courage. Together, their characters mirror one another, reflections distorted until magic forces them to align. What makes them compelling is not that they switch places, but that in switching, they reveal how much of themselves was already hidden within the other. The mother discovers the echoes of her own youthful rebellion still alive in her daughter's laughter and mistakes. The daughter recognizes the seeds of her mother's resilience already budding in her own heart. They are not opposites, though they believe they are. They are continuations of one another, the past bleeding into the future echoing the past. The supporting characters orbit around this central pair like moons, each reflecting back another facet of their struggle. Friends, teachers, co-workers, relatives. They are painted in strokes broad enough for humor, but precise enough to sting. The co-workers who dismiss or overburden the mother represent the world's blindness to invisible labor. The classmates who ridicule or idolize the daughter embody the cruelty and fragility of adolescence. Even the relatives at the wedding, with their gossip and expectations, remind us of the suffocating pressures of family performance. The rituals we enact to convince ourselves that everything is in order. There are moments when these secondary characters steal the stage, not through grand monologues, but through the subtlety of presence. A friend's laugh that feels more like betrayal than camaraderie. A co-worker's dismissive glance that cuts deeper than any insult. A sibling's silence at the dinner table that reveals more than words ever could. These characters remind us that no one exists in isolation, that every life is lived in a web of influence, judgment, misunderstanding, and occasional grace. Yet what is most striking is how the film refuses to flatten its characters into caricatures, despite its comedic premise. The mother is not simply the nagging parent, nor the daughter merely the bratty teen. Each is given moments of dignity, moments of collapse, moments where we want to reach through the screen and hold them, because we know that feeling, we have lived it. That is what elevates the film beyond its fantasy. The characters are not masked for comedy. They are vessels for truth. I think often the mother's eyes, tired but defiant, when she inhabits her daughter's body and realizes how merciless the world of youth can be, or the daughter's trembling hands when she signs documents in her mother's office, the ink smearing slightly because she cannot quite control the weight of adulthood. These gestures matter. They are the language of character beyond dialogue, the ways in which performance becomes revelation. The actors inhabit these roles with a delicacy that suggests they, too, understand the weight of the archetypes they are playing. The antagonists, such as they are, do not come in the form of villains. There is no great enemy to defeat, no dark sorcerer controlling the spell. The antagonists are life itself, bills, expectations, peer pressure, the slow erosion of patience, the sharp sting of generational misunderstanding. In this way, the film reminds us that the greatest conflicts we face are often not against others, but against time, responsibility, and our own pride. Every character is, in some sense, a mirror held up to the audience, daring us to see ourselves not just in the heroes, but in the pressures that shape them. What makes the character study so compelling is that it refuses to offer clean resolutions. By the end, the mother and daughter are closer, yes, but not magically free of conflict. They still bicker. They still misunderstand. But beneath it now runs a current of empathy, the kind of empathy that does not erase differences, but makes them bearable. Their arcs are not about becoming identical or fusing into one another, but about recognizing that love is not built on sameness, but on the ability to see another person fully and still choose to stand beside them. And so, as the credits roll, we do not remember just the laughter or the spectacle. We remember the characters, their flaws, their stumbles, their small moments of grace. We remember the way the mother's shoulders slumped with exhaustion, the way the daughter's voice cracked with vulnerability, the way both of them carried pride like a shield until it finally shattered. We remember them because we know them, because they are us. What fascinates me about cinema, beyond the screen itself, is how much of the story begins long before the audience ever takes their seat. A movie is never just what we see in 2 hours of light and sound. It is also the quiet accidents, the unplanned collisions, the laughter and frustrations of countless people trying to conjure a world out of imagination. And with this film, the strange and curious facts of its creation are almost as compelling as the story it tells. They're like the hidden annotations in the margins of a book, footnotes that reveal not only how a story was written, but what it meant to those who created it. Perhaps the oddest fact is how long it took for this sequel to find its way into existence. The idea had been floated more than once in hushed studio conversations, often dismissed as a curiosity, a would have whispered between executives with half smiles. For years, it languished in development hell, caught between nostalgia and skepticism. What could a new story say that the original had not already said so well? Yet, strangely, it was not the executives who breathed life into it, but the actors themselves. In one interview, it was revealed that during a reunion dinner, long after cameras had stopped rolling on their earlier collaborations, the cast members joked about what it would be like to do it all again now that they were older, more scarred by life. That casual musing, tossed into the air like a feather, became the seed of revival. It is peculiar to think that a billion-dollar studio machine could be nudged into motion by something as fragile as a dinner conversation. But that is the nature of storytelling. Sometimes the smallest spark ignites the largest flame. Another curious detail: the magical object at the center of the plot was not originally written as it appears now. Early drafts imagined something entirely different, something more elaborate and ornate, a device with mythology stretching across centuries. But as filming drew closer, the creative team chose simplicity instead, a trinket that felt ordinary, almost forgettable. Why? Because they realized that the stranger the object appeared, the less believable the story became. True magic, after all, rarely announces itself. It is hidden in plain sight, disguised as the everyday. So what could have been an overstuffed artifact became something modest, almost invisible. Precisely the kind of thing that could sit on a family shelf for years without anyone realizing its power. Then there are the accidents on set, the kind of mishaps that seem trivial but linger in memory, because they reveal the unpredictability of art. One day, during a particularly chaotic scene set in a kitchen, an appliance malfunctioned. A toaster, old and temperamental, sent bread flying clear across the room, nearly striking the camera operator. The laughter that followed was so genuine, so uncontrollable, that the director insisted they keep the energy alive by filming again without correcting the toaster. Some swear that a trace of that accident, the subtle unpredictability of objects in the background, made its way into the final cut. Watching the scene now, you almost expect chaos to burst from the most ordinary corners. And then there were the challenges with the script itself. The writers had to walk a fine line between honoring nostalgia and speaking to a new generation. Too much reference to the past, and it risked alienating newcomers. Too little, and it would sever the film from its roots. The strangest discovery was how much the world had changed since the original. Jokes that once felt harmless no longer landed with the same innocence. Social hierarchies in high schools were no longer mapped by the same tropes. The writers found themselves researching not only teenage slang, but also the evolving codes of online culture, trying to understand how technology shapes identity. One of them admitted, half-jokingly, that writing the teenage dialogue was harder than writing the fantasy. Fantasy, after all, can be anything, but teenagers are merciless when something doesn't ring true. There is also the strange fact of the film's casting process. Some roles were decided almost instantly, faces that seemed inevitable, but others shifted unexpectedly. A supporting character was originally meant for one actor, who, at the last moment, bowed out because of scheduling conflicts. The replacement, a younger and lesser-known performer, brought a completely different energy to the role. Sharp, unpredictable, electric. The dynamic on screen altered in ways no one could predict it. What had been conceived as a minor character suddenly became a fan favorite. Their lines quoted in online threads, their mannerisms mimicked by audiences. It is odd to think that something so iconic emerged not from deliberate planning, but from a scheduling mishap. Perhaps the most humanly strange detail comes from the rehearsal process. To prepare for inhabiting each other's lives, the actors playing mother and daughter spent days shadowing one another, not just on set, but in their real lives. The older actress attended a high school incognito, sitting in classrooms, eating in cafeterias, experiencing the scrutiny of teenage eyes. The younger actress shadowed the routines of adulthood, attending office meetings, paying bills, even walking through a grocery store with the invisible weight of responsibility. They called it method empathy. It wasn't perfect, of course. It could never be. But it created an authenticity that seeps into every scene. The strangeness of watching a seasoned adult struggle to blend in among teenagers, or a teenager trying to carry herself as an adult in spaces she barely understood, became the raw material of performance. And then there are the quieter curiosities. The way a certain scene had to be res hot 12 times because a dog on set refused to behave. The peculiar superstition of one crew member who insisted on carrying a particular charm every day of filming. The fact that one of the songs featured in the soundtrack was recorded in a single, improvised session because the scheduled track fell through at the last moment. Each of these details, small as they are, stitch themselves into the texture of the film. You cannot see them explicitly, but you feel them the way you feel the unevenness in a hand-woven cloth. The strangest fact of all, perhaps, is how the film almost wasn't funny. In its earliest incarnation, the tone was darker, more brooding, leaning heavily into themes of identity loss and existential dread. It was only through months of revision, through the instinct of actors and the urgings of test audiences, that humor found its way back in. And thank goodness it did, because without laughter, the weight of the story would have been unbearable. Yet traces of that earlier darkness remain, like shadows in the corners of a brightly lit room. You can sense them in the silences, in the moments where the camera lingers a second too long on a face, in the melancholy that tinges even the jokes. There is something oddly moving about knowing these facts. They remind us that films are not perfect constructions, but living, breathing organisms shaped by accidents, compromises, and bursts of serendipity. They remind us that behind every polished scene lies a history of broken toasters, rewritten jokes, last-minute casting changes, and actors fumbling their way into empathy. And in that, the film becomes not just a story about characters who swap bodies, but a story about artists who swap experiences, who stumble and laugh and fail until something true emerges. What strikes me most, in reflecting on these peculiarities, is how much they mirror the film's themes. Just as the characters are forced into strange, uncomfortable circumstances that reveal hidden truths, so too do the filmmakers find themselves navigating oddities and mishaps that ultimately enrich the story. The accidents were not obstacles. They were revelations. The strange facts are not trivia. They are part of the narrative itself, the invisible plot line that runs parallel to the one we see on screen. And perhaps that is the real magic. Not the spell within the film, but the spell of creation itself. A story is always stranger than it appears, stitched together from chance encounters, late-night revisions, technical malfunctions, and fragile hopes. To know these facts is to glimpse the humanity behind the spectacle, the fingerprints smudged across the celluloid. And that, to me, is always the most enchanting truth of all. What has always captivated me about this story is not merely the magic of the switch, nor the laughter that bubbles up from seeing characters stumble through each other's lives, but the way the events themselves act as mirrors held up to us, daring us to confront what we would rather avoid. The film cloaks its narrative in comedy, but the events pulse with deeper meanings, and to examine them closely is to unearth the skeletons of generational conflict, empathy, and identity. The first critical moment arrives not with grandeur, but with the ordinariness of conflict in the kitchen. To the casual eye, it is nothing more than a spat between mother and daughter, raised voices, sharp words, impatience that stings. But look closer, and you see an event as old as storytelling itself, the eternal tension between generations. This scene is not about toast burning or misplaced priorities. It is about the invisible gulf between two lives lived side by side, yet never truly understood. Here, the comedy is secondary. The primary function is revelation. It sets the tone for everything that follows, showing us that the true antagonist is not a person or a villain, but the chasm of misunderstanding that lies between love and recognition. The switch itself is perhaps the most obvious of the film's critical events, but its significance cannot be overstated. When they awaken in each other's bodies, we laugh. It is absurd, uncanny, slapstick in its execution. Yet beneath the humor lies an existential question. What does it mean to lose yourself? The horror of looking into a mirror and not recognizing the reflection is a metaphor for adolescence, for adulthood, for every moment in life when you feel alien to yourself. The switch is not simply a device to fuel plot. It is a symbolic crucible, burning away the comfort routine and forcing each character to inhabit not only a different body, but a different truth. The school hallway scene, where the mother as daughter faces a cruel gauntlet of teenage judgment, is another such event. To a critic's eye, it is a commentary on the brutality of adolescence, the way social hierarchies enforce themselves with precision sharper than law. The mother, stripped of her adult authority, learns that survival in this world requires codes and performances she never valued. This moment resonates because it forces us to recall our own youth, the sting of ridicule, the suffocating pressure to belong, the sense that every mistake would be remembered forever. It is more than a gag. It is a reflection of a cultural truth that transcends the screen. Equally significant is the daughter's collapse in the office. Sitting at a desk covered in papers she cannot understand, drowning in responsibilities she once dismissed as trivial. Here, the comedy falters into tragedy. watching her stumble through conversations, watching her fail to command authority. We begin to see adulthood not as freedom, but as imprisonment in endless obligations. This scene works critically because it reverses the gaze. Teenagers often dismiss adult struggles as dull, lifeless, irrelevant, but this event demands empathy. It makes visible the invisible labor that parents carry, forcing us as viewers to consider how often we, too, have dismissed the unseen battles of those who cared for us. The rehearsal dinner event, one of the narrative's most chaotic points, can be read critically as a microcosm of family performance itself. Weddings are not only celebrations but spectacles, rituals in which families parade stability and happiness before the world, even when fractures tremble beneath the surface. The chaos that erupts when mother and daughter, trapped in each other's skins, fumble through speeches and expectations is more than slapstick. It is a critique of how families demand performance, how we wear masks to convince others of our unity even as misunderstandings gnaw at us. The collapse of order here is a revelation, a tearing down of illusions. Then comes a quieter, almost hidden event, the conversation under the glow of streetlights, where they finally speak honestly, stripped of performance. It is not grand, not cinematic in its staging, yet it may be the most critical event of all. Here, the comedy of the premise dissolves, and what remains is the raw ache of human connection. The words exchanged are imperfect, but they carry the weight of years of silence breaking open. A critic cannot help but note how deliberately small this moment is compared to the larger spectacles. It suggests that transformation does not come from magic or chaos, but from confession, from vulnerability. The performance scene at school, where the mother inhabiting her daughter delivers something clumsy yet sincere, is another fascinating event to examine. On one level, it is comedy, the awkwardness of a grown woman trapped in adolescent insecurities. On another, it is a radical act of honesty. In a culture that prizes masks and perfection, sincerity becomes rebellion. Critics have noted how the scene undercuts expectations, refusing to deliver a flawless triumph, instead choosing an imperfect human victory. This choice speaks volumes about the film's refusal to cater to neat resolutions. The professional presentation scene, where the daughter as mother finds the courage to channel resilience she never believed she had, operates similarly. It is not about mastery. It is about survival. The stumbles, the nervousness, the cracks in her voice all remain visible. But what matters is that she does not collapse. This event critiques the very notion of success as flawless execution, reminding us that endurance itself is often the greatest victory. The wedding climax, layered with chaos, mistaken identities, revelations, and emotional explosions, can be read as both comedy and tragedy. On one level, it is pure farce. People fumbling through rituals, confusion erupting into spectacle. On another, it is a symbolic breaking of the facade. Weddings, as I've said, are stages where families pretend a harmony. This event tears the stage apart, forcing truth to erupt in front of everyone. It is messy, embarrassing, and yet profoundly liberating. Critics often point to this moment as the heart of the film's thematic resonance, the destruction of performance as a prerequisite for genuine connection. The reversal of the spell itself, subtle and unannounced, is another critical point. Unlike other fantasies, this film does not grant a glowing portal or a thunderclap to mark the transition. Instead, it comes quietly, almost incidentally, after truth has been spoken. This choice matters. It critiques the very nature of cinematic magic, suggesting that what transforms us is not spells or destiny, but the act of finally seeing and hearing one another. The magic is symbolic, not causal. It is empathy that reverses the curse, not time or ritual. The final scene, the return to an ordinary morning in the kitchen, is perhaps the most radical event of all. After chaos, spectacle, and laughter, the film refuses to end with grandeur. Instead, it closes where it began, in the small routines of life. But everything is changed because they are changed. Critics love to point out how the ordinary morning becomes extraordinary simply because empathy has entered it. The coffee still pours, the toast still pops, but the silence is no longer hostile, the words no longer arrows. The event here is not magic or spectacle, but the recognition that transformation is not escape from the ordinary, but the ability to inhabit it with tenderness. What makes these events so resonant, critically, is how they refuse to be just plot points. Each one, examined closely, operates as both narrative device and cultural critique. The film never preaches, but it always implies, about families, about generational divides, about the invisibility of labor, about the cruelty of adolescence, about the masks we wear. Every comedic stumble carries within it a shadow of tragedy. Every chaotic eruption conceals within it the possibility of healing. And perhaps that is why the film lingers beyond its runtime. It is not the jokes we remember, nor even a fantastical switch, but the way events force us to reconsider our own lives. We think of the last time we dismissed someone's struggle. We think of the masks we wore at family gatherings. We think of the silences we allowed to grow too wide. In this sense, the film's events are not simply fiction. They are provocations, gentle but insistent reminders of the work empathy demands. The making of a film is always its own kind of drama, often more unpredictable than the story that eventually unfolds on screen. We see the polished product in theaters, neatly edited and scored, but what we never see are the long nights, the hurried rewrites, the accidents that become blessings, the laughter that erupts when things fall apart. With this film, the production itself feels like a hidden narrative, a secret sibling to the story we know, filled with its own strange twists, improvisations, and surprising acts of grace. The earliest insight that fascinates me is how delicate the balance was between honoring nostalgia and creating something new. Everyone involved knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. Sequels to beloved films often falter because they lean too heavily on sentiment or try too desperately to reinvent. The creative team wrestled with this tension for months. There were drafts of the script that leaned heavily on callbacks, peppered with winks to the past, but these fell flat in rehearsal, too self-aware, too much like parody. Other drafts swung too far in the opposite direction, stripping away any memory of the original and leaving something unmoored. What they discovered, slowly and painfully, was that the key was not in replicating the old or abandoning it, but in weaving nostalgia into the texture of the new. You feel in the way certain lines echo the past, not as jokes but as refrains, like familiar melodies woven into new songs. One of the funnier behind-the-scenes facts is how seriously the cast and crew took the body swap premise, even off camera. To prepare, the lead actresses shadowed each other's mannerisms for weeks. They mimicked posture, speech rhythms, even small gestures like how one tucked her hair behind her ear or how the other sighed when exasperated. Between takes, crew members joked that they could no longer tell who was imitating whom. At one point, during a lunch break, one actress began ordering food in the exact cadence of the other, and everyone burst into laughter at how uncanny it was. The seriousness of the exercise blended into comedy, but it gave the performances their authenticity. When we see them stumbling through each other's lives on screen, it feels earned because they had already been living that strangeness off-screen. Filming itself was not without its hiccups. There was the infamous cafeteria scene, which had to be res-hot half a dozen times because background extras couldn't stop laughing at the absurdity of the dialogue. Each time the leads delivered their lines with exaggerated teenage bravado or weary adult exasperation in a teenager's body, the extras cracked, ruining the take. Eventually, the director allowed some of that laughter to bleed into the scene, deciding that the rough edges added to the authenticity. If you look closely in the final cut, you might spot a background character suppressing a smile that doesn't quite fit the tone, an unintentional artifact of genuine amusement that somehow makes the moment feel even more alive. Another delightful quirk came from the costume department. The team faced a challenge of designing wardrobes that could believably belong to both characters once the switch occurred. Clothes had to look ordinary enough to belong in either life, but specific enough to carry personality. There was one outfit, a simple jacket, that became a quiet symbol of the film's production. The mother's actress loathed it, finding it uncomfortable, while the daughter's actress loved it, insisting it gave her swagger. They argued playfully about it between takes, until the jacket became a kind of mascot for the set. Crew members even took turns trying on, laughing at how it seemed to change their own moods. By the end of filming, the jacket was nearly threadbare from use, and the costume designer admitted it had been repaired more times than any other item on set. Then there were the accidents that shaped the film. In one rehearsal, during a heated argument scene, a glass slipped from the actress's hand and shattered across the floor. Everyone froze, waiting for the director to call cut, but instead, he urged them to continue. The jagged intensity of that moment, the shock, the raised voices, the glint of shards on the kitchen tiles, found its way into the rhythm of the scene, even though the glass never broke again in subsequent takes. It became a reminder of how fragile the line is between performance and life, how often the best art comes not from control, but from accident. One of the most endearing fun facts is how the cast built their own rituals to survive the long shoots. Every Friday, no matter how grueling the week, they gathered in the break room for what they called freaky karaoke. Someone would bring a speaker, and they would belt out songs, sometimes in character, sometimes just as themselves. Crew members joined in, and soon it became a tradition. One assistant joked that those karaoke nights bonded the team more than any team-building exercise could. The echoes of that camaraderie are visible on screen. You sense the affection, the rhythm of a team that has laughed together, stumbled together, and carried each other through exhaustion. The director himself became a curious figure during production. Known for his precision, he surprised many by embracing improvisation. He encouraged actors to throw in unscripted lines, to lean into awkward pauses, to let accidents breathe. This looseness gave the film its texture. Some of the funniest exchanges in the movie were never written. They were born in the moment, sparked by instinct. The director later confessed in interviews that he had learned to trust chaos more than control, that the unpredictability of actors fumbling through borrowed lives mirrored the unpredictability of the story itself. And yet, there were also grueling challenges. The wedding scene, with its sprawling ensemble cast, elaborate staging, and layers of emotional chaos, nearly broke the schedule. Extras had to be wrangled, continuity had to be maintained, and emotions had to escalate without tipping into farce. At one point, filming stretched into the early morning hours, cast members collapsing into chairs between takes, makeup smeared, voices hoarse. But when the scene finally came together, the exhaustion seeped into performances in ways no rehearsal could have manufactured. You can see it in their faces, the weary laughter, the rawness of their voices, the trembling vulnerability. It was real, born not only of acting but of lived fatigue. Music, too, carried its own strange story. One of the soundtrack's most memorable tracks was composed almost by accident. The scheduled musician fell ill, and in a panic, the team asked a young assistant composer to fill in. She stayed up all night, scribbling melodies, layering sounds. What emerged was haunting, imperfect, and utterly right. The producers expected to replace it later, but when test audiences responded with surprising intensity to that track, it was kept. Today, it stands as one of film's most beloved musical cues, a reminder that brilliance often comes from unexpected corners. There are even stories of superstition on set. One crew member, convinced the production was cursed, carried a small charm in his pocket every day. Whenever accidents occurred, a broken prop, a malfunctioning light, he would mutter about bad luck, clutching his charm tightly. The cast teased him, but he became a kind of mascot for perseverance. By the end of filming, several others had adopted their own talismans, from lucky pens to oddly chosen socks. Superstition and ritual became part of the film's texture, an invisible thread binding everyone together. Looking back at these insights and fun facts, what strikes me most is how they mirror the film's themes. Just as the characters are forced into chaos and discover themselves through it, so too do the productions stumble into accidents, improvisations, and late-night karaoke, only to emerge with something more authentic than perfection could have given. The fun lies not only in knowing these behind-the-scenes quirks, but in realizing how human they make the film. They remind us that cinema is not carved in marble. It is messy, fragile, unpredictable, stitched together from laughter, exhaustion, accidents, and love. And so, when I watch the film now, I do not only see the story of mother and daughter stumbling into each other's lives. I also see the laughter of background extras who couldn't keep straight faces, the jacket passed from hand to hand, the composer bent over a piano at dawn, the glass shattering in rehearsal, the weary cast singing karaoke at midnight. These invisible layers hover just beyond the screen, reminding us that every movie is two stories at once, the one we see and the one that made it possible. The world of a film is often as much a character as the people who inhabit it, and this story is no exception. What fascinates me is how the settings in which the drama unfolds carry their own silent weight, how the rooms, streets, and hallways seem to echo the struggles of those who move through them. The film does not dazzle us with exotic locations or grand spectacles. Instead, it roots itself in the ordinary, the familiar, the spaces we recognize from our own lives, and in doing so it transforms them into mirrors of a human condition. The kitchen is where it all begins, and it is more than a kitchen. It is a battlefield disguised as domesticity. The refrigerator hums with indifference. The toaster spits bread too quickly. The table collects crumbs from hurried breakfasts. Light filters through blinds and slanted stripes, catching the dust that hovers in the air. These are details so ordinary they are almost invisible, yet within them simmers the quiet tension of a household stretched thin. It is here that the first barbed words are exchanged, here that silences ache louder than shouts, here that the invisible gulf between mother and daughter first reveals itself. The choice to open in such a space is deliberate. We are not introduced to sweeping landscapes or otherworldly vistas. We are thrust into the intimacy of domestic life, where conflict is most raw because it cannot be escaped. Then there's a high school, rendered with an accuracy that feels almost painful. The hallways are long, sterile, fluorescent-lit caverns where voices echo and footsteps become percussion. Lockers line the walls like silent witnesses, their dents and scratches the hieroglyphs of generations. The cafeteria buzzes with a chaos that is part laughter, part fear. The classrooms, with their mismatched chairs and outdated posters, feel less like places of learning than arenas of survival. Every detail reminds us of the cruelty and vulnerability of adolescence. To walk through these halls is to be reminded of how exposed one feels at that age, how every stumble feels monumental, because the walls themselves seem to amplify it. The office setting, where the daughter in her mother's body falters under the weight of adult responsibility, is its own kind of stage. Desks form rows like soldiers, fluorescent lights hum with fatigue, and computer screens glow with the cold blue of obligation. Papers pile up in stacks that look less like work and more like barricades. The setting itself exudes exhaustion. It is not hostile, exactly, but indifferent, a place where individuality dissolves beneath protocol. The daughter, fumbling through this environment, seems dwarfed not only by the responsibilities but by the architecture itself. Critics often note how the camera lingers on her smallness in these spaces, framing her against vast walls or wide desks, underscoring her alienation. And then there's the rehearsal dinner space, dressed in elegance yet trembling with unspoken fractures. Chandeliers glitter overhead. Tables are draped in white. Wine glasses clink with forced cheer. But beneath the surface, every detail feels precarious. The perfection of the setting only highlights the imperfection of the people within it. Family gatherings are supposed to look harmonious, and so the setting insists on its own beauty. But the tension in the air makes that beauty feel like a mask. The eventual chaos of the scene is heightened by the fragility of its setting. The more carefully constructed the stage, the more satisfying its collapse. The wedding itself, the climax of setting and story, is staged like a grand theater performance. Rows of guests, flowers adorning aisles, music swelling in rehearsed crescendos. It all feels choreographed to project unity and joy. And yet, as chaos erupts, the setting becomes almost satirical, as if mocking the very idea of perfection. The pristine decorations seem to tremble under the weight of truth spilling out. The choice of such a polished setting is critical. It amplifies the dissonance between appearance and reality, between what families show the world and what they endure privately. Beyond the physical locations, the film's atmosphere is constructed through cinematography that straddles comedy and melancholy. Bright, saturated colors dominate the lighter moments, lending an almost playful energy to the switch's absurdity. Yet, in quieter or more painful scenes, the palette shifts. Shadows linger longer. Colors mute and the camera slows, allowing silence to stretch. The contrast between tones mirrors a contrast between comedy and tragedy, reminding us that both coexist inseparable in life as an art. The camera itself seems to embody the perspective of empathy. When the mother inhabits her daughter's world, the angles tighten. The The shots close in, emphasizing claustrophobia, vulnerability, the suffocating weight of adolescent judgment. When a daughter inhabits her mother's life, the framing shifts to wider angles, showing her dwarfed by desks, conference rooms, endless bills. Cinematography here is not passive. It is an accomplice, shaping our emotional response by aligning us with the character's disorientation. We are meant to feel what they feel, not merely observe it. Lighting, too, tells its own story. The kitchen glows with a harsh morning brightness, unkind to fatigue and impatience. The school hums with fluorescent sterility. The office is bathed in a pallid blue that leaches warmth. But moments of reconciliation, those rare, fragile ones, are lit differently. Streetlights cast long, gentle glows. Candles flicker in the background. The warmth of these settings contrasts with the coldness of the others, suggesting that tenderness itself creates its own light. Even sound plays a subtle role in shaping setting. The clatter of lockers, the rustle of papers, the clinking of dishes. These mundane sounds amplify the realism of each space, grounding the fantasy in ordinary textures. The score, alternately playful and melancholic, threads itself around these sounds, sometimes echoing them, sometimes undercutting them. There's a particularly striking choice in one scene where the music fades, leaving only the sound of breathing and footsteps, as if to remind us that even in the chaos of magic, the body remains stubbornly, vulnerably human. What makes these settings powerful is not their grandeur, but their familiarity. We have all eaten breakfast in kitchens heavy with tension, walked hallways where laughter and cruelty blurred, sat at desks that seemed to drain us of identity. The film does not invent new worlds. It holds up our own, exaggerating just enough to reveal their truths. The settings become mirrors, cinematic elements sharpening them into allegories. And so, when I think of the film, I do not only remember the characters and their arcs. I remember the kitchen's hum, the fluorescent glow of the school, the cold blue of the office, the brittle perfection of the wedding hall. I remember how cinematography turned these spaces into symbols, how lighting revealed tenderness, how sound grounded fantasy in the ordinary. The settings are not background. They are protagonists in their own right, silently shaping the story, reminding us that where we live our lives is as important as how we live them. What we see on screen is only half the story. The other half is told in the quiet moments between takes, in the exhaustion that seeps through long nights, in the laughter that bursts when things go wrong, in the invisible camaraderie that holds a cast and crew together when schedules stretch too thin. The making of this film carried its own secret narrative, one that never appeared in trailers or press releases, but lived in the memories of those who built it. To glimpse that narrative is to see the humanity behind the spectacle, and that, to me, is always the most fascinating story of all. The first thing that stands out is how deeply the actors committed to inhabiting each other's worlds. The body swap premise could have easily fallen into parody, exaggerated performances that relied on caricature, but the director insisted that sincerity would make it work. And so the actors built an odd sort of trust exercise. They shadowed each other obsessively, watching, mimicking, even borrowing mannerisms. The younger actress confessed later that she caught herself sighing in the same rhythm as her co-star, even offset. The older actress admitted that she started slipping teenage slang into her conversations at home, confusing her family. This odd mimicry blurred the lines between preparation and life, until even crew members joked that they were witnessing a kind of accidental transformation before the cameras ever rolled. Filming was not always smooth. The cafeteria scene became legendary among the crew, not for what made it into the film, but for how often it fell apart. Extras could not stop laughing. Sound equipment picked up stray echoes. Trays clattered too loudly in the background. Each retake pushed the cast further into absurdity, until the laughter was no longer scripted but real, spilling uncontrollably across the set. The director, rather than fight it, encouraged the chaos, telling everyone to let the silliness breathe. Some of that raw, unscripted energy made its way into the final cut, a reminder that authenticity often hides in imperfection. There were also moments of surprising tenderness on set. One afternoon, between takes of a particularly heavy argument scene, the younger actress broke down in tears, overwhelmed by the intensity of channeling emotions she was not accustomed to showing. The older actress, still in costume, wrapped her in an embrace, and whispered words no microphone ever caught. Crew members turned away respectfully, but the image lingered. Later, when watching the final cut, one could sense that something of that real tenderness had seeped into the fictional relationship. It was no longer only acting, but a glimpse of genuine compassion flickering through the roles. Challenges abounded, as they always do in filmmaking. The wedding sequence nearly derailed the schedule. Coordinating the movements of so many extras, musicians, and actors felt like directing a small army. Continuity became a nightmare. Flowers rearranged themselves, candles burned too quickly, costumes wrinkled under the heat of lights. The cast endured endless retakes, voices hoarse from repeating vows, laughter, and arguments. Yet, in hindsight, the exhaustion gave the performances a rawness no rehearsal could have manufactured. You can see it in their faces. The flushed cheeks, the strained smiles, the genuine weariness. These details, unintended, became part of the truth of the scene. Not all difficulties were grand. Some were strangely small, almost comic. A dog on set refused to behave, breaking focus with sudden barks. A prop phone rang too early. A microphone picked up the sound of crew members' stifling laughter during a particularly absurd exchange. Each mishap became part of the lore of the set, retold like campfire stories when the crew gathered after long days. There was even one day when the power cut unexpectedly, plunging the entire set into darkness. Rather than panic, the cast sat together by the glow of their phones, telling stories until the lights returned. That impromptu pause bonded them more than any scripted exercise could. The crew, often invisible in the final product, carried their own stories. Camera operators joked about the difficulty of capturing sincerity in chaos, how they sometimes had to move like dancers to keep up with the improvisations of the actors. The costume team labored endlessly to maintain continuity, repairing the same jacket, so often became a symbol of production itself. The sound team, battling echoes and laughter, grew so adept at catching nuances that they could anticipate which lines would crack the extras before they even started rolling. These details remind us that films are not only made by stars, but by dozens of hands, each adding their own invisible artistry. Interactions between cast members carried their own flavor. The older actress became something of a mentor, guiding the younger one not with lectures, but with quiet advice between takes. In turn, the younger actress brought a looseness, a playfulness that lightened the atmosphere when schedules grew heavy. Their chemistry was not merely scripted. It was lived, built in whispered jokes, in shared glances across crowded sets, in the patience they extended toward one another. Crew members often remarked that they seemed like a real mother and daughter by the end, not because of resemblance, but because of the rhythm of their interactions. The quick banter, the exasperated sighs, the laughter that burst after arguments. Behind the lens, the director's philosophy shaped everything. Known for control, he surprised many by encouraging improvisation. He allowed pauses to stretch, encouraged actors to throw in unscripted lines, invited crew members to suggest adjustments. This looseness created a texture of authenticity, a sense that the world of the film was not rigid but breathing. One critic later observed that the film felt alive in a way most comedies did not. And perhaps the reason lies here. Behind the scenes, life was allowed to spill into art, uncontrolled but precious. There were superstitions, too, because every set breeds them. One crew member refused to start a day without touching a particular lamp in the studio, convinced it brought luck. An actress carried a small charm in her pocket during every take, a gift from her grandmother. Others swore that the laughter of karaoke nights, Friday rituals where cast and crew belted out songs together, warded off exhaustion. These small rituals, silly to outsiders, became anchors during the chaos, grounding everyone in a shared rhythm. Perhaps the strangest behind-the-scenes fact is how the film nearly lost one of its most beloved moments. A scene in which the mother, trapped in her daughter's body, delivers an awkward but sincere speech at school was almost cut during editing. Producers worried it slowed the pace, but the director fought for it, insisting that the rawness of that moment was essential. He won, and today audiences point to it as one of the film's most memorable scenes. Knowing how close it came to disappearing makes it feel even more precious, as if we glimpsed something fragile that nearly slipped through the cracks of commercial decision-making. By the time filming ended Exhaustion was heavy, but so was affection. Cast and crew parted with rituals. Photos, shared gifts, small tokens of gratitude. Some took home props, not as trophies, but as reminders of what they had built together. One actor confessed later that she kept a crumpled piece of script, scribbled with revisions and coffee stains, pinned to her wall as a reminder of the chaos that birthed art. When I think of the film now, I cannot separate from these behind-the-scenes insights. The laughter of extras breaking character, the shattered glass that forced improvisation, the karaoke nights, the quiet mentorship, the superstitions, the exhaustion. It all lingers, humming beneath the polished narrative. And perhaps that is fitting. The story itself is about lives colliding, stumbling, failing, and discovering grace. The making of it mirrored that same truth. In the end, both on screen and off, it was not perfection that mattered, but the willingness to endure chaos together until something true emerged. When I look back on this film, what lingers most is not the mechanics of its magic, nor even the slapstick of mismatched bodies fumbling through unfamiliar routines. What lingers are the themes, the undercurrents that hum beneath the laughter, the whispers of symbolism stitched into the most ordinary gestures. The story wears a mask of comedy, but behind that mask it is a meditation on empathy, identity, generational conflict, and the quiet ways in which love bruises and heals. To watch it closely is to be reminded that every joke carries a shadow, every laugh a secret ache. At its heart, the central theme is empathy. The body swap conceit is not merely a plot device, but a metaphorical crucible, forcing characters to inhabit the lives they dismiss. The mother, who once believed her daughter's struggles trivial, comes face to face with the merciless cruelty of adolescence. The daughter, who scoffed at her mother's exhaustion, staggers beneath the crushing weight of adult responsibility. Their laughter and humiliation are not simply comedic. They are the painful birth pangs of understanding. Symbolically, the swap embodies the ancient desire to step into another's skin, to see with another's eyes. It reminds us that empathy is not a soft virtue, but a radical act, one that demands discomfort, vulnerability, even suffering. Identity is another theme threaded through every frame. What does it mean to look in a mirror and not recognize yourself? What does it mean to carry a body that does not feel like yours? The horror and comedy of their predicament mirrors the disorientation of adolescence and adulthood alike. Teenagers often feel alien in their own skin, bodies changing faster than their minds can comprehend. Adults, too, sometimes glance at their reflections and feel estranged, wondering where youth has gone. The film externalizes this inner estrangement, turning metaphor into literal spectacle. The symbolism of the mirror recurs throughout, not only as a prop, but as an idea. To face oneself is always terrifying, whether you are 16 or 45. Generational conflict hums constantly beneath the narrative. The arguments in kitchens, the silences in hallways, the exasperated sighs. These are not simply personal disagreements, but echoes of a larger human story. Parents and children locked in cycles of misunderstanding. The symbolism of the switch transforms this conflict into revelation. The mother's authority is dismantled. The daughter's rebellion collapses under the weight of bills and responsibility. Each discovers the fragility of the other's world. The theme here is not that conflict disappears, but that empathy softens its edges. Love does not erase difference. It learns to live with it. There is also a quieter theme, performance. Families, schools, offices, weddings, all are stages where people act roles assigned to them. The mother plays the responsible provider. The daughter plays the rebellious teen. The wedding itself is the grandest performance of all, a ritual of perfection masking fractures. The chaos of the switch exposes these performances, stripping masks until truth bursts out. Symbolically, the film critiques the idea of stability as performance, suggesting that true connection emerges only when facades collapse. The symbolism of setting reinforces these themes. The kitchen represents domestic tension, the battlefield of ordinary life. The school, with its fluorescent sterility, symbolizes the cruelty of conformity. The office embodies the suffocating weight of adulthood. The wedding hall, pristine and glittering, represents the illusion of familial harmony. Each space is both literal and metaphorical, a stage upon which themes are enacted. The collapse of order in these settings becomes a symbolic breaking of illusions, reminding us that truth is always messier than performance. Even small objects carry symbolic weight. The magical trinket that triggers the switch is deliberately ordinary. Its power lies not in its grandeur, but in its invisibility. It symbolizes the hidden forces that shape our lives, moments, words, accidents that seem trivial yet change everything. The mirror, recurring again and again, symbolizes alienation and recognition. The jacket, worn and repaired, becomes an unintentional symbol of endurance, of identity slipping between wearers yet somehow retaining continuity. These objects remind us that symbolism is not only in grand gestures, but in the smallest details. The theme of love itself is complex here. It is not the tender, romantic love of fairy tales, but the difficult, bruised love of family. Love that nags, love that resents, love that sacrifices so deeply it sometimes forgets joy. The switch forces love into the open, stripping it of performance and excuse. The characters learn that a love is not simply provide or to rebel, but to see fully, even when it is uncomfortable. The symbolism of light plays here. Harsh fluorescence exposing flaws, soft streetlights illuminating reconciliation, candles flickering in moments of vulnerability. Light itself becomes a metaphor for love, sometimes unkind, sometimes tender, always revealing. Comedy, too, has symbolic weight. Laughter here is not only entertainment, but survival. In the absurdity of a mother fumbling through slang or a daughter drowning in paperwork, we glimpse the resilience of the human spirit. Comedy softens pain, but it also exposes it. The symbolic function of laughter is dual. It hides the ache while also revealing it. Critics sometimes dismiss comedies as light fare, but here the comedy is symbolic of life's refusal to let tragedy dominate. Even in the midst of chaos, we laugh, because laughter is the only weapon we have against despair. The wedding climax embodies a convergence of themes and symbols. It is staged as perfection, flowers, music, ritual, but collapses into chaos as truths spill out. Symbolically, this is a destruction performance, the tearing down of facades. The spell breaks not because of ritual, but because of confession, vulnerability, truth. The wedding setting, meant to symbolize unity, instead symbolizes the illusion of it, shattered until genuine empathy emerges. This inversion is what gives the climax its resonance. What fascinates me most is how the film balances its symbolism so subtly. Nothing is heavy-handed, nothing announced. The mirror is never explained, the trinket never mythologized, the performances never sermonized. Instead, the film trusts us to notice, to interpret, to feel. This restraint gives the themes their power. They do not lecture. They haunt. They linger in our minds long after credits, reshaping how we see our own kitchens, offices, schools, weddings. And perhaps that is the greatest theme of all. Transformation. Not magical transformation, but the transformation of perception. To step into another's skin is to see differently. And once you have seen, you cannot unsee. The characters return to their lives changed, not because magic solved their problems, but because empathy did. That, to me, is a film's symbolic heart. Magic is a metaphor. Empathy is the real spell. When I think of it now, I realize that every element, the objects, the settings, the lighting, the comedy, is part of the symbolic tapestry. The kitchen hums with the theme of domestic strain. The school glows with the theme of conformity and cruelty. The office drowns in the theme of invisible labor. The wedding hall bursts with the theme of performance undone. The mirror whispers of alienation. The trinket of chance. The jacket of endurance. The laughter of resilience. Together, they form a story that is not only about a mother and daughter, but about us all, stumbling through lives we do not fully understand, desperate to be seen, desperate to see. And that, my love, is why this film lingers. Not because of its plot, not even because of its humor, but because of its themes and symbols, the truths it smuggles beneath the laughter, the reflections it forces us to confront. It reminds us that empathy is the only magic that matters, that love is both wound and balm, that performance crumbles but truth endures. It whispers that we, too, must dare to look in the mirror and see not only ourselves but others reflected back. When you peel back the layers of a film like this, past its laughter and its story, you discover the quiet machinery that makes it possible. The techniques of filmmaking, the invisible choices of sound, editing, framing, rhythm that shape what we feel without us ever naming it. Most people walk away remembering the jokes, the characters, the chaos of mistaken identity. But beneath all that is a craft, the careful stitching of image and sound that convinces us to care. And alongside that craft runs the story of how the film fared in the world beyond the screen. Its journey through box offices, audiences, critics, the unpredictable alchemy of art meeting commerce. To reflect on both is to see the full anatomy of the film, how it was made, and how it lived once it was released. The most striking technique is the way the camera itself tells a story. Cinematography is never neutral. It always takes a side, always whispers perspective. Here, when the mother inhabits her daughter's world, the shots tighten, the frames close in. The camera hovers too close to faces, lingers in hallways that feel claustrophobic, catching the overwhelming noise of adolescence. It forces us to feel what she feels. That high school is not just a building but a gauntlet, every laugh amplified, every stumble magnified. Then, when the daughter inhabits her mother's world, the camera does the opposite. Wide angles dominate, showing her small against conference tables, dwarfed by piles of paperwork. The technique is subtle but relentless. We are never allowed to forget whose perspective we inhabit. Cinematography itself becomes an accomplice to the swap, bending the world to echo the disorientation of the characters. Editing shapes the rhythm of that disorientation. Quick cuts in the school scenes mimic the chaos of teenage life, the fragmented nature of gossip and judgment. Conversations interrupt each other. Images tumble too quickly, creating a rhythm of anxiety. In contrast, the office scenes drag, with longer takes, pauses stretched, silences lingering uncomfortably. The editing teaches us to feel time differently depending on the life we are inhabiting. Adolescence is frantic, overwhelming. Adulthood is heavy, endless. The contrast is not explained, but it is felt, carved into the rhythm of the film's pulse. Sound, too, tells its own story. The clatter of lockers, the shriek of sneakers on tile, the laughter that feels more like knives and joy. All of these fill the school setting. In the office, the hum of fluorescent lights, the endless clicking of keyboards, the muffled sighs of weary colleagues create a soundscape of monotony. But in moments of intimacy, when truth seeps through performance, the sound quiets. Music fades, leaving only the raw texture of breathing, footsteps, the catch in the throat before words spill out. This stripping down reminds us that beneath chaos, beneath spectacle, what matters is a human voice, trembling with confession. Lighting is perhaps the most symbolic of all techniques. The kitchen glows too harshly in the mornings, unforgiving to fatigue and frustration. The school flickers with the sterile indifference of fluorescence. The office drowns in pale blues that sap warmth. But moments of reconciliation are lit differently. Street lamps cast long, soft shadows, candles glow. Windows let in evening light that softens every edge. It is as if the film itself is telling us. Empathy creates its own light, a light that cannot be faked but only discovered when pride falls away. Filmmaking techniques are not only in the obvious but in the invisible choices. Where the camera does not go, when the sound is allowed to drop, how silence is trusted. The director trusted imperfection. He allowed pauses that lingered too long, laughter that broke character, gestures that were clumsy. These choices gave the film its texture. Life is not smooth, so the film refused to polish itself too much. You can feel in the way conversations sometimes overlap awkwardly, or how a joke doesn't quite land but is kept anyway. The imperfections are deliberate, a rejection of sterile comedy in favor of something messier, more human. The box office story of the film mirrors its themes. When it opened, expectations were cautious. Sequels are notoriously unpredictable, especially those tethered to nostalgia. Some critics predicted it would sink under the weight of comparisons. And yet, something about it resonated. Audiences, perhaps weary of spectacle-heavy blockbusters, found solace in its smaller scale, its blend of humor and heart. Families came in droves, drawn not only by the memory of the original, but by the promise of laughter rooted in something real. The first weekend exceeded projections, and word of mouth did what no advertising campaign could. People left theaters not only amused but moved, telling friends that the comedy carried truth. The film's financial success surprised even its studio. It opened strong, but what stunned analysts was its endurance. Week after week, ticket sales held steady. It became a film people saw not once but twice, bringing children, parents, friends, as if the film itself were a conversation piece, a catalyst for reflection. Critics noted its unusual ability to spark dialogue across generations. Teenagers laughed at the absurdity, parents sighed at the recognition, and together they shared something rare, empathy born of art. Internationally, the response was equally curious. In some markets, cultural nuances shifted the reception, but the core theme of generational misunderstanding proved universal. Audiences from vastly different contexts recognized themselves in the mother sighing over bills, the daughter rolling her eyes at authority. The humor translated, but more importantly, the ache translated. The film's box office trajectory became a case study in how stories of family, however specific, resonate across borders. Of course, not all reception was glowing. Some critics dismissed it as frivolous, unwilling to look past the body swap premise. Others argued it leaned too heavily on sentiment. But even those reviews admitted the sincerity of its performances, the authenticity of its craft. And sincerity, in a cinematic landscape often dominated by irony, proved magnetic. Its imperfections became its strengths. Its comedy became its critique. Its smallness became its universality. What intrigues me is how the box office success mirrors the film's message. Just as the characters discover empathy in imperfection, audiences discovered resonance in a film that did not try to be flawless. It was messy, awkward, uneven, and deeply human. The success proved that people do not crave perfection as much as they crave truth. Even in comedy, especially in comedy, truth lingers. When I think of the filmmaking techniques now, I realize how invisible they are to most viewers. Few leave theaters speaking of editing rhythms or lighting palettes. And yet, those invisible choices sculpt everything we feel. The claustrophobia of adolescence, the weight of adulthood, the warmth of reconciliation, all were crafted deliberately, invisibly. When I think of the box office story, I realize how audiences, too, responded to something invisible. They may not have named empathy as the theme, but they felt it. They may not have analyzed cinematography, but they noticed that they felt smaller in one world, heavier in another, lighter when reconciliation glowed. Together, craft and reception tell a single story, that art lives in the invisible. A cut here, a pause there, a choice of light, a muffled sigh, a family buying tickets together, a teenager rolling their eyes but secretly moved, a parent laughing too loudly because they recognize themselves on screen. The techniques shape the experience. The box office proves the experience mattered. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of this film. It was never meant to dominate charts or redefine genres. It was meant to tell a story of misunderstanding and empathy, using the tools of cinema with precision but humility. And in telling that story, it found not only success but resonance. Filmmaking techniques made us feel it. Box office success proved we wanted to. And somewhere in the middle of laughter and receipts, art happened. Not perfect, not polished, but true. What I find endlessly fascinating about films is not only what the characters do within the story, but how the actors breathe themselves into those roles, and then how audiences breathe life back into them. A movie lives twice. First in its making, through the alchemy of performance, and second in its reception, through the conversations and emotions of those who witness it. With this film, the cast and their reflections and interviews, along with the chorus of audience reviews, form a parallel narrative, one that tells us as much about the movie as the movie itself. The central performances, of course, belong to the mother and daughter, played by two actresses whose chemistry could not have been manufactured. What struck me in interviews is how both spoke not only of the challenge of mimicking each other, but of the vulnerability it demanded. The older actress admitted she was terrified of playing a teenager believably. "I thought I'd embarrass myself," she confessed with a laugh, but then she paused and added, "And maybe that was the point, to feel embarrassed, to feel small again, because that's what being a teenager is." That honesty seeps into her performance. When she stumbles through high school drama, the awkwardness feels lived rather than acted. The younger actress, meanwhile, spoke of the shock of playing adulthood. She admitted in one candid interview that she cried after her first day of filming office scenes. It wasn't even acting. It was just realizing how heavy it all is. Sitting at that desk, I thought, is this what my mom feels every day? It broke me. That raw confession reveals why her portrayal of exhaustion feels so authentic. She wasn't only acting responsibility. She was encountering it for the first time. Their mutual respect became the spine of the film. In press tours, they often tease each other, finishing each other's sentences, mimicking each other's gestures. But beneath the jokes, there was clear affection. Crew members later remarked that by the end of filming, they truly seemed like mother and daughter. Not because of resemblance, but because of rhythm. They bickered with affection, rolled eyes with laughter, hugged with sincerity that could not be faked. That relationship carried through the screen, and audiences felt it. Supporting cast members also shared stories that revealed the humanity of the set. One actor, who played a comedic side character, spoke of how much improvisation shaped his role. "Half my lines weren't in the script," he said. "I just said what felt right, and somehow it stayed in." His looseness brought a spontaneity that audiences adored, with many reviews highlighting his scenes as unexpected highlights. Another cast member recalled the exhaustion of shooting the wedding sequence, describing it as organized chaos that somehow turned into art. Their reflections remind us that even supporting players carry the weight of storytelling, each contributing threads to the tapestry. What struck me most were the cast reflections on the themes. Many of them spoke not of comedy or box office numbers, but of empathy. The older actress said, "I think this story matters because it reminds us we don't know each other as well as we think, even in families, especially in families." The younger one echoed, "It's about learning to stop rolling your eyes and start listening." These comments revealed that the cast understood the deeper resonance, that they were not only performing but believing in the story's message. Audiences, too, responded with surprising depth. In reviews, people did not only laugh at the jokes, they reflected on their own families. Parents wrote about watching with their teenagers and crying together. Teenagers wrote about seeing their parents differently after leaving the theater. One review said simply, "I went in expecting to laugh. I left wanting to call my mom." Another confessed, "I haven't spoken to my daughter in weeks, but after watching this, I texted her, just to say hi." These are not typical reactions to comedy. They are evidence that the film transcended entertainment, becoming a catalyst for conversation and reconciliation. There were, of course, lighter reviews too, audiences praising the humor, quoting favorite lines, celebrating the awkward dances, the over-the-top chaos of the wedding. Many delighted in the chemistry of the leads, calling it uncanny and heartbreaking in all the right ways. Social media buzzed with memes and GIFs, yet even those often carried affection, not mockery. The humor was embraced, but always tethered to the warmth of the story. Critics were divided in the usual way. Some dismissed it as formulaic, unwilling to look past its premise. But even skeptics admitted the sincerity of performances. Others praised it as a rare comedy that carried emotional heft. One critic wrote, "It's messy, it's uneven, but so is life, and that's why it works." Another noted, "It sneaks up on you, you laugh, you roll your eyes, and then suddenly you're crying because you see yourself in it." These reviews mirror the film itself, imperfect, sometimes clumsy, but unexpectedly moving. In interviews after the film's release, the cast reacted to this reception with humility. The younger actress said, "I never thought people would cry. I thought they'd just laugh at me trying to act like an adult." The older one smiled and added, "That's the thing about comedy. People think it's about jokes, but it's about truth." Their reflections reveal an awareness of the film's unique place. Not groundbreaking in form, but quietly powerful in impact. The audience's voice matters because it gives the film its afterlife. Beyond box office numbers, beyond critics, it is the personal stories that keep a film alive. Families who rewatch together, teenagers who reluctantly admitted they saw themselves, parents who softened their judgments. All of these became part of the film's legacy. A movie is never just what is on screen. It is what people do with it afterward. And here, audiences turned it into conversation, into reflection, into change. What I love most is how these reviews and interviews together reveal a loop. The cast gave themselves to the story, fumbling through vulnerability, risking embarrassment. The audience received that vulnerability and reflected it back, sharing their own. The loop continues. Actors learning from audiences, audiences from actors, each shaping the meaning of the film beyond the frame. And perhaps that is the greatest success of all. Not the numbers, not the awards, but the fact that people walked away wanting to listen more, wanting to call their parents, wanting to bridge silences. The cast gave us a story of empathy, and audiences turned it into an act of empathy. In that exchange, the film transcended itself. Every story has to end, though the best ones never really do. They linger, they echo, they return to us in moments we least expect, like an old melody carried on the wind. This film, wrapped in comedy and sprinkled with magic, might seem like a light diversion at first glance, but when I sit with it, when I let it breathe in the silence after credits, I realize it has carved something tender and lasting in me, and that, perhaps, is the greatest achievement of all, to sneak into our hearts disguised as laughter and leave behind questions, reflections, even reconciliations we didn't know we needed. What have we seen, after all? A mother and daughter who cannot hear each other, locked in a cycle of frustration that feels achingly familiar. A world that intervenes with absurdity, forcing them into one another's lives until they finally see what had been in front of them all along. We have walked with them through kitchens that felt like battlegrounds, through high school corridors that echoed with cruelty, through office spaces that drowned in monotony, through weddings that pretended at perfection only to collapse into truth. We have seen comedy blur with tragedy, awkwardness with revelation, laughter with tears. And in the end, what remains is not the spectacle but the tenderness, the recognition that love is messy, empathy is difficult, and truth is never as polished as we wish it to be. We have explored the plot in all its twists and turns, not simply as entertainment, but as allegory. We have examined characters not as archetypes, but as reflections of ourselves. The tired mother whose sacrifice has become invisible, the restless daughter whose rebellion masked fragility, the supporting figures who embody society's cruelties and expectations. We have traced the strangest facts of production, the quirks and accidents that shape the film, reminding us that art is born as much from imperfection as from planning. We have considered events critically, seeing how each moment reveals larger truths about performance, about family, about the ache of misunderstanding. We have peered behind the curtain at fun facts, settings, symbols, interviews, reviews, and the hum of box office life. Each layer revealed another truth, that this film, for all its comedy, was never about magic at all. It was about us. And so, when I step back and ask myself what lingers, the answer is simple: empathy. The film insists on it, demands it, and ultimately gives it. It tells us that to love someone is not control them or even understand them fully. It is to attempt to see them, even when it hurts. It whispers that families are not built on perfection, but on endurance, on small gestures, on the willingness to keep showing up even after mistakes. It reminds us that laughter and pain are siblings, not opposites, and that sometimes the only way to reach each other is through a story absurd enough to make us laugh until we cry. For me, the conclusion of this journey feels like a mirror turned toward my own life. I think of arguments I have had, silences I have allowed to grow, people I thought I understood but never really did. I think of times I rolled my eyes at burdens I did not carry or dismissed struggles I did not endure. And I wonder, what would it have been like to step into those lives? Even for a day? What tenderness might I have found sooner? What pride might I have laid down earlier? That is the quiet power of a story like this. It does not preach. It simply unsettles us until we begin to ask ourselves questions we can no longer ignore. And so, my dear friends, my fellow literature enthusiasts, my companions in this cinema vault journey, I want to leave you with more than just a reflection. I want to leave you with an invitation. Let this film remind you not only of its characters, but of your own life. Let it push you to call someone you've been distant from, to listen a little more closely, to see beyond your own reflection. Let it remind you that empathy, though uncomfortable, is the only magic we have. If you have walked with me this far, through all the laughter and analysis, through the characters and the symbols, through the accidents and the behind-the-scenes truths, then I ask you, as always, to help keep this little corner of Cinema Vault alive. Subscribe if you haven't already, not as a favor to me, but as a way of keeping this conversation going. Share it with someone who loves film not just as spectacle, but as story. Someone who, like you, believes cinema is literature written with light. Leave your thoughts, your disagreements, your own stories in the comments. This is not a lecture hall. It is a circle, a gathering of minds and hearts who want to think about movies the way we think about novels, poems, memories. Because in the end, that is what the space is for. To look at films not just as entertainment, but as companions, mirrors, provocations. To see in them our own contradictions, our own laughter, our own fragile attempts to love. And if we can do that together, if we can turn Cinema Vault into not just a channel but a community, then every analysis, every reflection, every late-night ramble like this one will have been worth it. So, let us close this chapter not with finality, but with continuation. The credits may have rolled, but the story lingers. In your kitchens, in your schools, in your offices, in your weddings, in your laughter, in your tears. Carry it with you, and come back here to Cinema Vault, where we will keep opening these vaults together, film by film, story by story, heart by heart. Until next time, my friends, thank you for listening, for sharing, for thinking deeply when it would be easier not to. I'll see you in the next film, where we will once again peel back the layers and search for truth in the flicker of light and shadow. Until then, take care of each other, take care of yourselves, and never forget that empathy is the only real magic.